The assistant professor of football is 50 episodes. That should qualify for promotion. Henceforth, this is the associate professor of football. Seriously, I didn't plan this would be the 50th episode, but it's fortuitous timing. Whether you celebrate anything this season or not, I hope these days are refreshing for you and that they hold people and emotions if you want that, and don't if you prefer your own vibes and feelings. And for me, it'll be a mix of both and hopefully some skiing. Last year at this time, I read Michael Foreman's classic picture book, War Game, children's book, mostly fictional, set during World War I, involving hatred, hope, and Christmas, and soccer and life and death. And this December special is me. That is an audio interview with me that I gave to a fairly well-known German soccer culture podcast, Brennpunkt Orange. The host, Danny, asked good questions about my football biography, starting with the first Sturm Graz game I attended in elementary school. He asked about soccer in the US. He asked about my research and about this podcast. And a few of his questions I've gotten before, casually in conversations or in writing from you, from listeners. And so I thought this might be a good time to turn the table. I'm the one being interviewed today. The problem is just that interview was done in German and aired back in fall. So I took that German audio interview and with the help of AI, have an English version of the interview for you. You'll see the AI isn't perfect yet, but it's actually quite remarkable how well it worked from MP3 to MP3, despite the tech being still at toddler stage. So the voices you're about to hear are not mine and Denny's, but two AI voices who say in English as best as they can what we said to each other in German in the original interview. Original is in the show notes, by the way, and I'm playing a short little clip in the middle of this episode as well in German, so you know it actually happened, and I didn't just tell AI to talk like a genius and pretend it's me, like my students do. If you wondered in the past, though, about longer version of my background, here it is. Hope you enjoy. I'm off in 2 weeks during our winter break here, and then on again in January. Two songs to mention here. Last but not least, the one you hear in the background is a 16th century dance with words from the Hebrew Bible, from Isaiah. It's my favorite Advent song in English. I played the calm version of this last year after the War Game read aloud. This one I like better. It's got organ and percussion and gender-inclusive language for the divine and for humans. And their credit goes to the First Congregational Church of Lincoln, Nebraska. And if that's not your music, the song at the end of today's episode is from Die Schweine, translates to pigs, an all-female German indie rock band. I mentioned it at the very end of the interview with Denny, so there's good reason to play it. You can look forward to that as well. As far as I'm concerned, I go with 16th century tunes as well as 2000s feminist indie rock. All right, off to the interview. Remember, you're hearing AI voices now on an AI translation of a real interview. Okay, so retune your ears a little bit. You'll hear me soon, but it's not really me. Okay, so it's my words. Yeah, you get it. Denny first asked me where I was when we spoke, and I told him I was in my office. And then I said,
not a very big one, but with 3 extremely large windows. Half of this wall is a window in the office in Goshen, Indiana. And I'm looking out on a wonderful autumn leafy landscape. And behind me, in the back, there's a storm shell and other football things.
You have to imagine the place a bit closer, because I don't think 99% of the listeners know it.
Goshen, Indiana, is of course a scandal that it's so unknown in Austria. No, you're absolutely right. Goshen is not a big city. It's not the America you think of when you grew up with some series from California or New York. It has about 35,000 inhabitants, is a district capital in Indiana, very, very north of this state. That means we're relatively close to Lake Michigan, which alone is already as big as a third or half of Austria. So it's a huge lake. And on this lake lies Chicago, which is about 2 hours west of here.
That makes it clear. Today, we're taking you to a special place, or I'm taking you to a special place today, namely to America. And I say welcome and welcome to a new episode of the podcast from Brennpunkt Orange. Today, I have the exciting opportunity to talk to Philip Goldner about his podcast, the assistant professor of football, soccer, culture, and history. The podcast focuses on many exciting topics at the intersection of football, culture, and history. There are profound insights, and Philip illuminates with his guests from the social importance of football to historical development. In our conversation, I would like to learn a little bit about his motivation and the background of the podcast. But first, let's take a look at football in the USA. I just asked on my little Twitter channel how many people are interested in it. In Germany, there are very few people who are interested in football in the USA. Is that something you think is wrong? You should look more closely. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you perceive football in the USA.
It's almost difficult to tell any football fan to look here and here, because there is so much football every day that you actually have to be selective and sort out what interests you, and maybe also what interests you not only from the level of football, but also from a football cultural point of view. The point of view here, after I described it earlier, is that I am at a small private university. So the podcast name roughly corresponds to my profession. And we have 2 football teams here at the university, a men's team, a women's team, which, I would say, play in the 4th college league in the USA. And that's why I'm starting there, because it's somehow closest to what comes to me from clubs, from identity, and from color and place that somehow occurs in the game. The teams are not extremely successful in their leagues, but it is the most supported sport here at the university. I have 2 children, both in school age. I would say, even among them, playing football is a big thing. Of course, you see these celebrity jerseys in schools from time to time. But the teams are also quite attractive. So you definitely want to play football, and there are worse and better years. But they also play against other high schools, and spectators do come there. And that's a 3-digit number of fans, even at home games. And everything is amateur-based. So colleges and high schools are not allowed to pay their people directly for playing football, even if there are scholarships. And then there is a clear gap, which only happens in professional football in the USA. Men and women. I don't even know if I would want to direct the attention of Europeans there. I think the league is not uninteresting. Of course, they are currently being overshadowed by Miami. I think it is also developing fan culturally in a very, very interesting way. I think we can talk about that a little later. But the football world in the USA, which is actually the most interesting for me, is this university high school level. There's a lot going on, and there are spectators, for me included, who really, really like the game and often know themselves really well.
But then let's talk about the topic of fan culture and football in the USA. So there are actually always impressive images in Europe where you say, man, that's a fantastic voice. It's also nothing unusual to see female fans there, also in the first row. Has that developed in recent years? Is that completely normal? Is that some kind of a product of art? I'm not so sure about that. So has that naturally grown?
In most parts, yes. However, I think they are in a slightly different direction than in Europe. On the one hand, the idea that somehow, and I'm not saying that you have this idea, but if someone out there should have the idea that football in the USA is a phenomenon of the last decades, and only after World Cup '90, for it really starts, that's not true, of course. So there are projects remembered for their superstars. There is New York Cosmos, which got a shout out in the last episode of my podcast with David Kilpatrick. There are the tournaments of clubs like Coach Vienna, for example, in the Midwest in the interwar period. So football is already here, and historically it has always been something that was brought to me by migrants. First, second, third wave. And I wouldn't be surprised if you drew a graph like that and put the places in the USA where more migrants have moved over the last century and the number of visitors at football games or the active football players. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a correlation. The fan culture here is accordingly a mix of often white middle class, where football is a bit too chauvinistic, so American football, and then it grows up and goes to football and goes to the university and maybe opens up football connections there again. You know a little bit about Europe. You have a sense of the global football world. These fans also watch European games. They also look at European curves. And then the great passion for the game by various immigrant populations, often from Latin and Central America. And there's a mix of a lot. There's a mix of middle class, would like to be a bit rebellious at the weekend type people with Mexican Americans. There's a mix of a bit of ultra, at first still pose, but then really crafty, really elaborate things with a lot of culture from North America. And the whole thing then meets a club that's actually not a club, because the professional clubs in America are, of course, owned privately. And theoretically, without a membership or a regulator, the club could move in or move out tomorrow. A name change only recently happened with the women's professional team in Chicago. From the Red Stars, wonderful, they changed to the Stars, apparently. And there, and in many other pockets of the MLS or the NWSL, fans are building this politically pretty progressive fan culture. It's real. It's not set up by the club. But the clubs themselves are often closed to more direct fan involvement. And I think that's the bigger challenge than soccer literacy or fan cultural literacy. So I think there's substance behind that. The fan cultures often are not astroturf, but it takes place in a pretty difficult football and sports commercial landscape.
But can you still say that the enthusiasm has risen since the World Cup? Or what position does football have in American sports? I always had a memory of third or fourth among sports, but I'm at a great distance. Is that still the case, or has it really risen in terms of acceptance?
Yes, it should still be like that. But these statistics are often different things are calculated. You can calculate TV revenues. You can do a simple survey. And these lists are often just based on one professional league's viewership and don't adequately track the sport itself. What is a sport number 1, 2, 3? That would look pretty different depending on age, class, and area. If you ask, what sport did you play? Then I wouldn't be surprised if football was number 1. A lot of young people play football here. And if someone says American football, he might not necessarily mean the sport itself, but simply the professional league or his college team. What I never understood before I moved here is that there is so much on offer. As an Austrian, as a trained Austrian, you know the names of all kinds of skiers. And there were always good Americans where you thought, they must be superstars in the USA. And then you come over and ask someone, Lindsey Vonn, and so on. And the other person, who is interested in sports, has never heard of this person. Then there are some gymnasts who are extremely popular here, and no one in Europe knows them. Yes, it is pretty fragmented. The sports landscape, everything in everything, I would say. But the trend in football points upwards. If you look at the number of viewers, if you look at the interest in the younger generation, and I think also if you look at European games on TV. So I think the trend goes up. And the trend in baseball, for example, rather down.
How many professional leagues are there in America? Can you name that with a number? How many leagues work under professional conditions?
You can, sure. I mean, there are under the MLS the USL, which is divided into different sections from which you can't get up and down. I think there are 3 sections or so, which are already professional. The stupid thing is, there is no consistent league model with relegations. You buy yourself into a league system, and depending on the attractiveness of the opponent or the attractiveness of the league, it is then more expensive or cheaper. Our local semi-professional/amateur club plays in a lower league with a lower contribution.
That's something like associations. So I'm really completely naive because we wanted to put the focus of our conversation somewhere else. But of course, it is very, very interesting. Such a kind of association, or who organizes the leagues in the end?
The leagues are self-organized, but recognize the referee cooperation rules of the game, which are specific to North America from U.S. soccer. There is already a central association, which is by far weaker than a DFB in Germany or an OFB in Austria. And under this association, there are no leagues. So this is a pure management coordination position, which mostly lives from the youth national teams and youth camps.
How's the national team? Is there a big identification in the USA with the national football team?
I can really hardly say that, but I know relatively many Americans for whom the national teams are somehow the first starting point in football. So they can remember a U.S. national team at their Olympic tournament, the victory of the women's national team. But they have relatively little knowledge about which semi-professional clubs are in their area or so. So for the more superficially oriented football fan, It is either the national teams or the Premier League that are the starting point.
And the position of women's football, because you have already mentioned it several times, I understand so inconspicuously with you that it has a good position in America and is recognized.
Yes, I think so, absolutely. It has been the case for a long time that youth football has been seen especially as a girls' sport. The boys like to play American football and the girls play football. There are professional beginnings in women's football that really go back a long way, and there is a clear connotation between women's football and politically progressive scenes. So often in the fan clubs, in the Women's Professional League, for example, it is often relatively easy to recognize what is going on and what kind of culture is being formed. And that's cool. So the position of women's football here, which does not always have to fight for it, maybe like in Graz or like in Austria, that's cool. So when I go to women's football with my daughters here at the university, then it is not a heroic act, and it shows how especially woke we are. Then it is quite normal, and then there are many other men and male students on the stands and cheering.
It should, of course, also be about you. But before we get to that, due to the current situation, we open up a few days before the election in the USA. What role does sport actually play in this whole election? Such an emotional discussion is also drawn by the sport as it is drawn throughout America, isn't it?
Yes, and what I find a pity, even though football is, like all parts of our lives, football is political, but the sport types are increasingly coded a bit politically, I find it a pity. The masculinity of American football, the progressivity of women football national players, sometimes it is played out against each other. It is not a sport. It is a completely homogeneous culture in itself, but there are so many that social bubble thinking can at least be transferred a little to the sport.
Do you have concerns about what happens after the election?
Yes, well,
There are several politics podcasts that deal intensively with the topic. Let's talk about you. You grew up in Austria, right?
I grew up in Austria, yes.
How long were you there and where did you grow up?
I have to think back to the question of whether I have concerns over the election. I needed a second to think. Maybe it would be good to say that I teach at a relatively small private university. I know many of my students very well, and I know that if we get students from conservative areas, also conservative families, for whom the university is one of the first places of exploring new forms of self-expression, and if this kind of community would be attacked by political developments in the country, that would really worry me.
Yes, I understand that very well.
So Austria. Yes. I grew up in Eckersdorf near Graz and had a happy childhood. It is a rather rural community. Now there are more and more people who move out of Graz. When I was a child, I was definitely a bit of a provincial place. I went to the elementary school and then to the high school in the big city in Graz, a Catholic private school called Bischöfliches Gymnasium. Not because my parents were so incredibly Catholic, but because the school was a humanistic Bischöfliches Gymnasium and really a very good one. And I am very grateful for my time there. It had languages and philosophy. I had a very good school experience. It was not so strict. You shouldn't imagine that behind the corner the nun is waiting if people are farting.
The topic of languages seems to be extraordinarily present with you. Did I read that correctly, that you can speak 6 languages?
Yes, you can. You have to differentiate though depending on, some I can only read, Latin, and a little bit of Greek. Some I can understand and speak pretty basic, Swedish and French. And in 2, of course, I am very fluent in German and English. And then there is a little bit of the high school time and a little bit of what I wanted to learn voluntarily later. I always enjoyed languages.
Very impressive. And then I found that September 11th and the series The Simpsons play a special role. Can you solve that?
Well, it's not quite as spectacular as After School. My younger sister and I often watched the afternoon episode of The Simpsons, which the ORF broadcast. That was sometime at 3 or 3.30 or so. And one day it was in our gymnasium time. We were both already in high school. Then came this banner at the end of the gymnasium. And there was Twin Tower crashed and switched to ORF 2 live broadcast and so on. The parents came and we switched and saw how the two towers crashed. And the next few days, I was already very interested in politics. Then the next few days, I listened more consciously to the American discourse. George W. Bush was president and sometimes spoke a language that as a European you could hardly understand. I mean, here was this country that on the one hand is so progressive and so open-minded, and on the other hand with a president who says things that come from religion that would be completely unspeakable in Europe. So this contradiction between enlightenment and spirituality, and between vulnerability and huge power and inner diversity started to interest me. And I would just say that was the starting point for my interest in America.
And how did it go on? Because when we talk to each other today, there must have been at least a degree, promotion, dissertation. That must have been a continuous path. When did the USA become home?
There is an important step in between, namely Munich in Bavaria, and I studied American Cultural Studies at the LMU after a detour. Yes, that course of study exists there. Munich is one of the very few, yes, one of the few places in Germany where there is such a thing. After the war, of course, Marshall Fund financed. There is the American House in Munich, a kind of study conference center for American studies. And there is a pretty good study branch there. And after I first thought about politics, that I had to study political science, and then I thought about history in general. Maybe I decided to study American studies. And I enjoyed the history and the years in Munich very, very much. And when it came to it, I thought I could write and research pretty well. I enjoy it. I'm pretty good at teaching. And I had never been to the USA. So I wrote about what the history of this strange country tells us about the human constitution and the cultural diversity of the country. I wrote, but I had never been there. Then I applied for a few graduate schools. And yes, I applied. And then I came here. And I completed a master's degree at the University of Chicago and then Notre Dame in Indiana, the famous Catholic university. Yes, there it comes again, the Catholic University. I did my doctorate there, and I'm still in the area, at a much smaller but also private university nearby.
Yes, and you have to briefly explain who is looking for you more. We'll somehow come up with the topic. Church, faith, and I don't want to go too deep into the private, but it has something to do with your profession, with your current activity. Can you explain a little bit what you are currently doing and what the focus is?
Yes, I have to say that I am no longer Catholic, and I was always interested in the topic of religion and spirituality. And my research was mostly revolved around the question of how to use, change, adapt immigrants to their religion in the USA to either belong to it or to follow a separate path. And how does that relate to the hierarchy of races in the USA? So, race theories. There are certain religions through which immigrants feel a little more American, a little more white, that is, at the turn of the century, and others that make it easier to represent them as not part of America. Yes, that was my research in Notre Dame. There are some articles on the subject. A lot of what I teach has at least partly to do with it. And religious studies and American history, identity history, political history, immigration history. That's mostly the topic I focus on, if it's not about football.
Can you say everything right from your studies to the election of the college? Do you feel comfortable, or do you sometimes miss Austria?
Of course, not everything always goes right. I think that should. I don't know. No one can say that about themselves, if I'm honest. But I'm very grateful for how it went. I think it went very, very well. The city and the community in which I am now, with a university that has its own spiritual history, has a great openness for the world, is a good community, and has also opened academic doors that in Europe might not have opened so quickly, especially in the German academic job market. No, I'm very grateful. It's a good place to be, especially to be with children, and I miss things from Europe. Of course, absolutely. Starting with bread, then partly Austrians have a bit of darker humor. Every now and then I've already dropped comments that bring in such a stare. I still understand, that's possible in Austria, but not here. But it's the other way around, when I'm in Europe and it goes into the second week. then there are absolutely also things that I miss quite a bit from the Midwest. A certain openness for various ranges of life. The praise that this is normal or you don't do that. I hear it so much more often in Europe than here. And that's also something I miss when I'm back in Europe.
If we talk again in 10 years, will I still find you in America? Or do you sometimes think about going back to Austria?
In 10 years, both of my children are no longer compulsory to go to school. Well, then I would say, yes, I'm still here, but I have some nice grant or scholarship and buy myself free for the spring semester. And then I'm only in Europe.
Then let's come to the topic of football. You are a passionate football fan. Do you also have your own football experiences?
Yes, I do. But I don't think I have any to go into the history books. I trained once at the club test and scored really purely by chance. That's what I was told. I shot a wide shot goal, but otherwise I didn't really understand the game. I was 7 or 8 years old. I was always relatively easily overwhelmed by the game on the pitch. I didn't coordinate very well either. I enjoyed playing goalkeeper in the school team or a defender who somehow turned everything around. I absolutely enjoyed playing. My father also had the great idea to turn our meadow under the house into a small mini stadium for a few summers and to invite various friends, adults, and children for a mini world championship. I enjoyed playing there, but I was already more looking forward to advertising for the stadium. I was never a very good player. I enjoyed playing, and I especially loved the culture around football quite early on.
In your first visit to the stadium, your first bigger football, or your first football game with spectators that you experienced?
Yes, that was Sturm Graz against Austria Wien in the Gruben. I was still in elementary school at the time. My father took me with him. My father has been a big Sturm fan since childhood. He understood to pass it on in a way that at some point he himself liked it, and I said to myself that I am also a Sturm fan. This first game on the Sturmplatz was all Austria-Vienna sympathetic because Austria was super successful at the time. I looked at the table and thought, yes, great team. They're coming to Graz now. And Austria came then, I can still remember today, in the white jersey with Memphis on it. Cigarette advertising, unthinkable today. They came and it turns out I was pretty excited about the atmosphere in the Sturm sector. I found Austria a bit of an arrogant team. I was pretty impressed by Sturm and the atmosphere there. And then I left without knowing it as a lifelong Sturm fan. It didn't come immediately and suddenly, but it was just Sturm. Before I was really a football fan, I was a Sturm fan.
Are there any special experiences that you personally experienced together with Sturm that are unforgettable for you?
Yes, in the same season. The Sturm fans know the season I'm talking about. The coach is Jerkemik, and it's about the promotion playoff in the mid-90s. The beginning of the Kartnik times. There was an away derby at the GAK when we lost 4-0. It looked like the GAK would get promoted together with modeling, and we would have to go down to the second league. My dad said in the 80th minute that it was enough. We wouldn't go into the same streetcar as the GAK fans when they would be celebrating. So we sneaked out early. And a few weeks later, everything was different. The GAK was showing nerves, and we were in Graz again, my dad and I, at Sturm against TSV Leben. A certain Mario Haas scored and came in. All the boys who shaped the Champions League era. Then there was an away win at Linz, Steel Linz, now known as Blau-Weiss. I can still remember it. We were up late that evening. Surprisingly, the Champions League era was the golden era of Sturm. But that there was my darkest time at Sturm. I almost fell out of love with the club back then. Which, supposedly, you can't. You probably can't. But I was almost there. The glitter, the new logo, the Champions League ambitions. I was in high school, and there were a few years when I wasn't really interested. But I was interested in Austrian football. When a club called Vorwärts Steyr, now in the third league, had a horrific fall in the first league back then, no wins and near bankruptcy, I designed a self-painted magazine and I tried to sell it in school. It was called Voorwaarts der Darf nicht sterben, a kind of satire magazine that blamed the whole world for Voorwaarts' demise. So football always meant something to me, on an emotional level, but on a cultural level as well, as an outlet for satire, as an inlet for learning geography. When it turned out that Sturm's dictator at the time, Cardnig, might fall, I wrote my first letter to the editor to a newspaper in Graz and demanded that Sturm needs to basically go bankrupt and under administration so Ut could rid itself of Cardnig. And that is what happened. When that happened, I was already in university, and that seeming decline, the bankruptcy, the relegation battles, that is when the relationship between me and Sturm became more intense again. I am a member. I went to away games again while I was studying in Munich. Our ultra groups were beginning to find their voice of opposition and reform in the club, and I really loved that. Sturm was saved from the brink back then. And when I'm back in Austria now, I take my 2 daughters, and they will have their own stories. Being there this last spring was especially meaningful, as you could guess. So there is more to say, of course, but that's it from childhood on, in a nutshell.
Ich meine, im Gymnasium damals ein selbstgemaltes Magazin herausgegeben und versucht zu verkaufen. Das hieß Vorwärts Steyr darf nicht sterben. Und das ist in der Vorwärts Steyr Pleitenbeich- und Bahnensaison entstanden, weil die kurz vor dem Konkurs waren. Und ich habe dann selber eine Art Satire-Magazin gemalt. Also es waren immer, der Fußball hat mir immer was bedeutet. Auch wenn ich die damalige Richtung von Sturm mit diesem blau-grünen Wappen nicht so ganz einschlagen könnte. Als es dann mit der Cardnig-Ära zu Ende ging, habe ich, damals habe ich schon gar nicht mehr in der Steiermark gewohnt, meinen ersten Leserbrief an eine steirische Zeitung geschrieben und gefordert, dass es Sturm quasi zerreißen muss und Cardnig loswerden müssen. Und da war ich schon außerhalb. Und da hat es dann wieder richtig angefangen. Also da bin ich dann auch von München aus wieder auf ein paar Auswärtsspiele gefahren. Ja, und dann hier in Amerika war das immer eine wichtige Verbindung zur alten Heimat.
I already had the opportunity to speak with Benjamin Sikora, the Sturm historian, about the history of the club and the history of the Derby. In view of the current development, I have the feeling that he is satisfied with the club, and despite personal challenges, he is confident that it will continue like this or that the development will follow a good development. Are you also satisfied with the club's development? A strong fan scene that gives great performances, also in the cup, both on the pitch and off the pitch. And how the club presents itself, especially the change of the sporting director, which already gave a lot of discussion. But you have the feeling that it is a very well-organized process from the point of view of time. There is no ugly news at all. Actually, the club presents itself very sovereignly, right?
Yes, this is a golden era built on hard work. It feels different and hopefully more sustainable than 20 years ago. My trust in the stability of the club is greater than it was back then. I am still a member, and I think the fans view their role as custodians much more proactively now. And rightly so. Of course, Benny is much deeper into the things than I am. But from a very distant point of view, we can really be grateful for how Sturm is currently standing. That doesn't mean that I don't have any criticisms. They concern parts of the business side, marketing. It concerns also how the money is distributed within the club, also in view of the women's team, young players, amateurs. And I hope that there will be a push with the new training center. But on the whole, if you include all my Sturm times, then it is a very calm time now.
Are you interested in the national team?
No, not really. But I use the European Championships as a geography lesson for my children. We cooked a few things from the participating countries and looked at a few things. But I'm not in the loop much on national teams. I'll have to see if I have to reconsider this when the World Cup comes here in 2026. Of course, with Rangnick, the Austrian team now has a coach who does his thing very clearly.
And now there is a kind of directional dispute within the Austrian Federation. Do you follow that side by side? Not really, right?
Oh my. No, it's Austrian bureaucracy and ineptitude at its peak what seems to be going on behind the scenes there. The people that are allowed to get involved in really, really important sporting things. Oh well, that is Austria. And it carries with it good and interesting things, the Austrian ways. But no, I don't look at it that much. I think Fabio Schaub from the best league in the world said at some point this week, it's better to go somewhere than go in 9 different directions. So let's hope they can clarify what they are about.
I found no VAR on your Twitter profile in the bio. Are you not completely satisfied and happy with the video referee?
No, I'm not quite satisfied and happy. I'm not a technophobe. But I do not see that there are technological developments that are intuitive enough to help to make the game a more beautiful game, with a few exceptions. Many make the game more ugly instead. I think we go to football to see a fight. We go to football to see beauty. We go to football to see identity and community. But at the end of the day, I don't think we go to football to see justice. And that's why I don't have this obsession with the perfect, precise decision. If there is a technology that makes the game run better and more beautifully, take it. Chip in the ball, for example. And if there is something that interrupts that, then. So I'm really having a hard time with VAR. I hope the pendulum swings back to common sense on this. The discussions have not become less. My hope was that we would have less to discuss. But we discuss more than ever.
Where there is one development in this context, which I don't think anyone has disputed, that is this chip in the ball. And the ball was recognizable.
Yes, exactly. That's really the discussion. That would be a good example. Exactly. We now have the feeling that a little bit of the original idea of football is taken away from us. We don't want everything like it used to be. And again use brown balls with huge seams. But the game must flow, and goals, usually, should be cheered without reservation again. Not this nagging question, oh, can I really cheer now? And it may also be that the game, by being observed by the VR in the higher leagues, slowly looks a bit different there from the games in lower leagues. Maybe certain physical movements, maybe certain considerations go differently from league to league now, based on whether a VAR is involved or not. And football should be like the Catholic Church, often a mess, but universal. VAR is taking us in another direction. And I watch myself again and again when I look at games here, where there is of course no VAR. I see the scenes a little differently when I know in the back of my head that the goal is still being checked. And I think that's a shame. It should be the same game, as far as possible.
In the last episode of your podcast, it was a bit about the Day of Reformation. And you had an author who discusses 95 theses on the reformation of football. So from your point of view, when you see the development of football, does that worry you? And do you immediately have solutions that should be different or maybe formulated differently? If you are at the top of the UEFA tomorrow, what would you fight for as president of the UEFA? Well, you should have warned me about that question before. Maybe the development of football in general. Does that worry you?
Get rid of SV strip thing. No, seriously. The Austrian Cup competition is incredibly charming. Every first, second, or third cup round with the games on the Austrian village grounds is like a bit of a home vacation. On this first cup weekend, I have 4 to 5 OFB TV things running while I'm doing some housework. But if I were UEFA president, we are in a situation where I don't know how many national associations or even UEFA can cope with the systematic problems. Overall, I believe that football has the potential to be a bit of a counterpart to many of our problems. The postmodern, the distance from meaning in life, from identity, from community. I believe that football has the potential to be a counterpart. But I really have my doubts whether something like this can be tried on a federation or national level. I don't know. But certainly, Red Bull.
My first name in Austria would be the FC Liefering and Red Bull, the supposed independent club in the second league. But it is the second representation of Red Bull.
Yes. And what really irritates me is that this is being normalized. and Austria is ahead of the curve, because it is not normal that there is a club with these special rights, even though it is a classic second team. And of course, now it is becoming more and more normal to have this multiple ownership of a football club. But how good should it be for football if a brewery plays against the second brewery? If a car manufacturer, the football club, a car manufacturer from Ingolstadt plays against a car manufacturer from Wolfsburg who belong to the same group.
It is foreseeable where that will lead us. Do you see that with worries? Or do you say, I am more interested in football and its history? I don't care about anything else.
Yes, of course. And I think everyone who listens to the podcast that I produce notices that. Of course, I am very worried about it. 4 weeks ago, I think, the episode came out with 2 people from Leeds who are dealing with the Red Bull phenomenon. And I am from Austria, especially in this regard. I feel a bit of a moral guilt about such topics. We sent this drink into the world and these 2 bulls. And now they're bloody everywhere. And what I can't do anymore today, what I might have said 5 years ago, is that isolation is possible. So it's not like, oh, the pure football is still here or here anymore. I rather believe that Austria is not somehow backward in these things, but ahead of the curve. I think some of these things that you see in Austria regarding commercialization, they will end up outside as well and already have. Many Austrian soccer fans completely underestimate that.
I think you put it quite aptly, but you have already mentioned your podcast. What inspired you to make this audio format available to the football world?
The first podcast I listened to regularly was Black FM, from a Sturm context. So pretty much from the beginning of when podcasts reached somewhat of an audience, 2016 or so. Of course, this is a club-related podcast. So is and was the podcast on West Ham United I listened to regularly. For a long time, I knew I'd enjoy audio as a format, but had research and writing obligations tied to my work as a professor and thought I have no clear reference of what a podcast can be about, so probably not for me. During the pandemic then, I don't remember how, but Nick Kastner's audio format was recommended to me. I've never talked to him, but I know who he is. Greetings at this point. There was a summer, I think it was 2021 or 2022, where I listened to quite a lot of audio formats, especially the football historical ones. Your podcast also came up. I don't know why, but the moment is somehow with me. I'm standing here at home. We have these huge maple trees, which have to be cut quite often. I was standing on a ladder cutting around a tree, while listening to one of your episodes with the FC Lusteno people. I thought, interesting, it's kind of like traveling in my head, football opening up the world and people again. A bit like when I came to love the game as a child and teenager. Then, after listening to so many German-speaking things in the summer, I thought, is there such a thing in English? Something football cultural. Something that is not about the results of the weekend or not just about one club. And of course there is. No question. But I think the assistant professor of football contributes something interesting and niche that adds value to the English-speaking conversation. So I thought, I have contacts. This could be a nice project. I'm going into my 7th year teaching now. I now have a permanent position. I have a few liberties with my time. So, doing this podcast has been fun from the beginning and is still fun today. It's a bit of a football cultural translation of Europe into the USA. That's why the words football and soccer are both in the title and subtitle, by the way. It's a nice connection between the continents for me. Something that is also creative and pleasant and makes me curious and keeps me curious. You do great topics with wonderful guests and in a very special way.
How did the title of the podcast come about?
The name was clear from very early on. There are in the USA and certainly also in some European countries. Well, so much has changed in the university landscape in the last decades, especially in Germany. But here, there is the entrance as an assistant professor, and the next level is the associate professor. Then you get a permanent or full position as a professor. I thought I didn't know enough to include a full football professor in my podcast. That's why I chose the assistant professor of football. Actually, I am professor for American history, but it fits well.
It fits well. How do you choose your guests? Do you have a defined program?
I usually take a summer break where I think a little about which topics are more than just current for the coming year. Where are there countries that interest me? When football starts again in August, I look at the semi-legal stream sites and pick up on a few stories and directions. There are also more general considerations. Is there anything that is new to me and that is interesting beyond the day? Are there clubs or activities? And then, of course, there are academic publications or near academic publications. Are there new books out? We discussed two fairly theoretical German books, for example, or recently David Kilpatrick, an English professor, was here. But club portraits, and you may be able to confirm this, always go over particularly well, download-wise. But I also like to do the more basic episodes, Step Back, Football Cultural Questions, and a topic with more than just a reference to the day to put in the center.
Does the English language help that, or is it sometimes also an obstacle because you can't get one or the other guest or guests?
I only had one case where someone said, "My English is not good enough as a European." I think it was a German. And then it turned out that his English was absolutely good enough and he became a guest. Most of the guests are, of course, from English-speaking countries. And a large part of the listeners sits in these countries as well, though especially Sweden and Germany have some who listen from the very beginning.
How did this connection to Sweden come about?
I've always liked Scandinavia, from about as early as I turned to Sturm. And when I spent a very difficult year in the Austrian Federal Army, yes, obligatory service, not my wisest decision or best year, I learned the language and traveled and have been back multiple times since. When I was at a conference in Sweden last year, I was allowed to visit Degerfors, a wonderful city in the Swedish Rust Belt. And in terms of football culture, a bit of a cradle of Swedish football. A lot happened there. A lot of threads came together. It's a small town, but the connection is still there. Their president has Austrian roots. And there are people who are interested in Swedish football and who I already knew before the podcast.
What can they expect in the next few months? Can you reveal what topics and guests you have invited? Or should you rather be surprised what comes into the podcatcher?
A trip to Spain is well overdue. It will go to Scandinavia again, but not Sweden, and if everything really works out, there will be an episode about football poetry.
If we listen to an episode again in 10 years, what will your podcast project be like? Do you have any special goals? Or is it actually something that currently enriches your activity without a concrete goal? How should your podcast develop?
It's nice in and of itself, and I don't do it because I need a second job. So far, the podcast brings audience and access to the audience that I wouldn't have otherwise. It brings contacts, friendships. It makes me think interesting thoughts. But I think I'm in a phase where I should find out over the next year or so whether it will be a second academic or semi-academic base, or whether it can stay as it is. If it could go in an academic direction, then maybe I should use my freedom to do something in view of the World Championship. I know national teams don't interest me, but everyone is looking here now. And your first question, one of your first questions about fan culture in America, is it authentic? What's going on there? I think it deserves a little more attention. And maybe there are one or two research projects that are offered.
That sounds great. And I'm looking forward to more episodes with fantastic guests. Philip, thank you very much for showing us your career, your view of football in the USA and Austria. And thank you for your podcast and the episodes. The last word is yours.
I actually have a last word. Who knows? Oh, it must have been 2007, 2008, in the Sturm Stadion Liebenau, before the game. the beautiful song Ich hab ein Foto von dir from Die Schwein was played. Who is the stadium DJ responsible? Please let me know. That person has my eternal gratitude. It was wonderful to hear the song in a stadium, and to this day, I have no idea how it got into the mix list. So, greetings to Graz. Thank you very much, Denny, and thank you for what you do. It's mainly these smaller stories from football that I'm particularly interested in with you. And you do it very well and very patiently, and with a lot of sensitivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wenn es mir mal wieder so richtig scheiße geht, weiß ich, wer auch nachts um 3 auf meiner Seite steht. Du trauerst mit mir und du freust dich für mich. Du machst dir auch Sorgen und es stört dich nicht. Wenn ich bin, wie ich bin, ob nun eklig oder nett, ob pervers oder schön oder einfach nur fett. Ich hab ein Foto von dir in meinem Portemonnaie, damit ich dich, wenn ich will, jeden Tag sehe. Ich hab dein Foto bei mir, wohin ich auch gehe, denn wenn du immer bei mir bist, ist alles okay im Portemonnaie. Wenn wir dann zusammen durch die Kneipe ziehen und für ein paar Stunden dem Alltag zu entfliehen, singen wir und lachen, vielleicht weinen wir auch mal, doch du bist bei mir und es ist egal. Wenn ich bin, wie ich bin, ob nur eklig oder nett, ob pervers oder schön oder einfach nur fett. Ich hab ein Foto